Hello, my name is Lori Thomas, and I'm the Director of Research and Faculty Engagement at the UNC Charlotte Urban Institute and the Institute for Social Capital. I'm also currently serving as the Interim Director of UNC Charlotte's Urban Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our second in a 5-part series of virtual conversations that will lead up to our annual event in November, the Schul Forum. The theme of this year's forum is economic mobility, a topic that has been at the forefront of our community's consciousness and remains timely and important as we are reminded that the people most impacted by the lack of economic mobility in the Charlotte region are also those who bear the pandemic's worst economic and physical impacts. The UNC Charlotte Urban Institute has been a part of a community-wide effort to better understand the challenges we face in improving upward mobility. Our role has been that of a research partner, not only looking at historical conditions that led to our community's poor ranking in economic mobility, but also at some of the policy solutions that might be the key to building a more equitable and promising future for all of us. We are excited to dig deeper into policy solutions to this year's Schul Forum. The Schul Forum was established in 2019 with an endowed gift from two longtime supporters of the university, alumnus Marianne Schul and her husband Norm, who served as the Urban Institute's founding director in 1969. The Schuls have long believed in the Institute's power to bring the Charlotte region together in dialogue around important community issues, especially when that dialogue is informed by research taking place here at UNC Charlotte. And that brings us to our second sponsor of these Schul Conversations. In 2019, the Gambrell Foundation made a multi-year commitment to support research at the Urban Institute focused on the issue of economic mobility. An important component of that research is the Gambrell Faculty Fellows Program that funds faculty who are committed to exploring more deeply how issues within their respective fields might further our understanding of economic mobility. With these online forums, we're pleased to highlight and begin to highlight some of their work. Today's topic is transportation, but future webinars and conversations will look at health disparities, the racial wealth gap, and workforce development, and how our success in addressing each of these will increase the likelihood of success in moving the needle on the ultimate goal of greater economic mobility. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator for today's panel, Eli Portillo. Eli leads online engagement for the Institute as the Institute's Assistant Director of Outreach and Strategic Partnerships. For a decade before joining us at the Urban Institute, he was a reporter at the Charlotte Observer, where he primarily covered business, real estate, and local politics. Eli, thank you for being here, and I turn it over to you now to introduce our panelists and lead us in this Schul conversation.
Hi, thanks, Lori. Thank you to everyone who is joining us from the public, and thank you in advance to our fantastic panel that we have lined up here today. As Lori said, I'm the Assistant Director for Outreach and Strategic Partnerships here at the Urban Institute, and just some logistical notes about this. We'll be doing introductions and a sort of quick introductory talk from each panelist, then a few rounds of questions for all the panelists, and then we'll be going to audience questions, which we'll be taking out of the chat. So as you listen, as you think about what we're hearing and learning today, please speak up and put your questions in the chat as we go, and we'll be looking to those to stimulate the conversation. So Charlotte is a sprawling Sunbelt city that really boomed in the post-war years as the automobile became king and cities scrambled to adjust. Streetcar lines that once moved workers from downtown to the far-flung suburbs like Dilworth and Elizabeth were torn up, and little country roads like Providence and Fairview grew to become main arteries. And as Mecklenburg County grew, we added more infrastructure to accommodate that growth. Highways like 77 and 85, the 485 Outer Belt, and eventually the Blue Line and Blue Line Extension. I know it feels like we're always 10 or 20 years behind the growth in a booming city like Charlotte, but there have been efforts to keep up. But at least pre-pandemic, traffic has been a perennial headache here, which if you've spent any time living in Charlotte and commuting, has, I think, gotten perceptibly worse over the past decade or so. With about half of our workers commuting in from other counties, 3/4 or more of us driving to work solo. How we get around has become a pressing issue for our economic prosperity, our quality of life, and our attractiveness as a region. Now, if you're fortunate enough to own a car, pay for its upkeep and insurance, your thoughts on transportation and economic mobility might extend no further than lamenting that traffic. But transportation is about more than getting from point A to point B. It's also a vital component of economic mobility. Whether you can afford the thousands of dollars it costs to own and operate a car has a profound impact on what jobs you can access. Whether you can get to grocery stores to buy fresh food, whether you can access medical care. And if you don't have a car, the effectiveness of our public transit system, or the lack thereof, plays a big role in whether you have those opportunities as well. Too many people in our community live in food deserts, healthcare deserts, spending hours on the bus to get groceries and go to medical appointments that many of us don't think twice about. This week in a Charlotte City Council meeting, staff discussing regional transportation initiatives estimated that a round trip for someone without a car from Salisbury to an oncologist in Huntersville would take about 8 hours and require 12 different bus routes round trip. And that's a trip that's not hypothetical for some people in our region. In Charlotte alone, the city proper, about 13,000 households don't have access to a vehicle. Nearly all of them are located in the low-income crescent of neighborhoods that kind of surrounds uptown to the west, north, and east. It's clear that transportation, or maybe more broadly, physical mobility, plays a key role in economic mobility. Whether you can move around our city and our region can help determine whether you can move up the economic ladder. So, here to discuss these ties today and all the complex ways that this fits together in Charlotte and our region as a whole, we have brought 3 experts. First up, we're going to hear from Dr. Evelyn Blumenberg, who's director of the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies and a professor at UCLA. Her work has focused on transit, transportation, low-wage workers, and other questions of urban geography. So, Dr. Blumenberg, I will turn it over to you. Please get us started here.
Great, thanks for the introduction, Eli, and good afternoon. It's morning here in Los Angeles, and I want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation about transportation and economic mobility, which has actually been the topic of my career. And so I have about 3 minutes. I'm going to just open with a few comments that kind of build on some of the things that Eli just said, and hopefully we can sort of return to these comments as part of the discussion later in the program. Next slide, or a slide. Next one. So I teach, my part of my full-time job is to teach in an urban planning program. And so I'm very well aware of the individual and social costs of automobiles. You know, most of our students come to study at UCLA to do transportation planning that shifts people off of driving because of, you know, some of the issues that are presented in this cartoon that I think we're very familiar with. Next slide. But as Eli mentioned, this picture is Los Angeles. In cities built around automobiles, clearly households without automobiles are at a significant disadvantage. Next slide. And they're largely at disadvantage because cars provide greater access to jobs than public transit within a given travel time. So what you see here on this slide is the ratio of jobs accessible in 60 minutes by automobile relative to transit. So the best case scenario all the way on the left is New York, where automobiles have a 4 times sort of access advantage relative to transit. So that's the best case scenario. And where I'm sitting right now is all the way on the right, so Los Angeles, where you can access 13 times as many jobs by automobile relative to public transit in 60 minutes. Next slide, please. And so this is what this looks like for Charlotte. So in 60 minutes in Charlotte, you can access all jobs in the metropolitan area and then some. So you could see the 132%. But only 6% of all jobs by public transit. And so just so you can get an idea Travel time, so median sort of travel time in the Charlotte metropolitan area is about 25 minutes. And so that auto to transit ratio in Charlotte is about 70-1, so 70 times more jobs accessible relative to public transit in about the median commute time in the metro area. Next slide. So I've been obsessed with this, and actually I've been sort of showing this slide, and lots of people have been sending me other images of things you could do in the car. So I think the automobile and the use of the automobile has been elevated during this particular pandemic. So COVID testing and vaccines, food donations, certainly fast food, working from your vehicle, accessing internet through your vehicle, entertainment, worship, all of that, right? So really structured around the vehicle, largely out of fears related to the use of public transit during this pandemic. Next slide, please. So studies show that automobiles are associated with a number of important outcomes, and we can certainly return to this. So you can see employment and earnings, the first bullet point. Next. The likelihood of living in higher quality neighborhoods with lower poverty rates, intergenerational economic outcomes, and then of course the last bullet point, important during this pandemic, but always the use of healthcare services. Next slide, please. So as Eli mentioned, there are huge disparities in automobile access. These are national data, not for Charlotte, but you could see among households in the bottom income quintile, almost a quarter are households without an automobile. You can see on the right the racial disparities as well. So 0 vehicle households among Black families, 14%, 8% among Asian families, 7% among Hispanics, and 4% among non-Hispanic whites. Next slide. And so I'm just going to conclude with just a few strategic directions that I think we will come back to that are in given these conditions in cities, certainly like Los Angeles and Charlotte, that we ought to be thinking about. The first is, and this won't come as a surprise based on what I've said already, thinking about strategies to increase automobile access among those who need that access by car the most. Next. I don't want to diminish the importance of public transit, particularly bus service, to meet the immediate needs of low-income travelers who do not have access to an automobile because they can't afford an automobile. We have to bring in affordable housing into the conversation, so low-income households can self-select into neighborhoods that do meet their transportation needs and other needs. And then finally, that it is really important if we're concerned about the importance and the access benefits of automobiles, that we need to think very broadly about moving beyond car-based planning by adopting policies to better manage driving in the automobile. So that's it.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I think that presentation really highlights kind of the tension that can exist between meeting people's immediate transportation needs and trying to plan for a future that is maybe less auto-reliant than we have now, because for better or worse, we have the cities that we've built and they're very hard to change overnight, as we've seen. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Elizabeth Delmel, who is a professor here at UNC Charlotte in the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences. She studied a lot of these issues and has actually, I believe, just wrapped up a project as part of the Gambrell Faculty Fellowships program, studying the relationship between transportation and lower income workers. So I will let her tell you more about that work and her expertise. Thank you very much, Dr. Delmel.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Yes, so that's exactly what I'm going to talk about, is this research project, which was supported by the Gambrell Foundation and the Urban Institute that I've done with my colleague, Dr. Isabel Nilsson, and a wonderful PhD student in our department, Providence Adu, who are both on the call. So our research project looked at a famous hypothesis that was developed in 1968 by a guy called John Kane, who observed that at that time, he looked at the spatial patterns of unemployment rates in cities, which at that time were highest in central cities. And he also observed where the jobs were, which at that time were increasingly suburbanizing. And he thought, okay, well, maybe it's this spatial separation that is a contributing factor to these high rates of unemployment, particularly among minority residents in center cities. And so this famous hypothesis was developed called the spatial mismatch hypothesis. And since then, tons of people have studied it. And some people have found some supporting evidence that if you improve accessibility, then you increase employment outcomes, which is an important policy consideration, which means that we can just solve one factor related to this by addressing transportation. I should also mention that lots of other people have pointed out other important considerations such as education, skills mismatch, a lack of social networks, discrimination in housing. So it's not all transportation, but this is key to our conversation. But since 1968, of course, especially in the last decade, our cities have been changing. And we no longer have this strong dichotomy of poor center cities and rich suburbs. We increasingly have reinvestment in center cities. And poverty is increasingly suburbanizing. So this first slide here, developed by Dr. Nilsson, shows the case for Charlotte. So if you pay attention to the blue line, that's showing poverty rates and suburbanization have increased over time since 1990. So we see more poverty out into the suburbs. So we thought, well, we should revisit this hypothesis because if lower income workers are increasingly spread out, is this spatial mismatch diminished? And what are the implications for different labor market outcomes? So specifically, we looked at how access or this physical separation between low income workers and low wage jobs has an impact on unemployment rates and income rates. I'll take the next slide. So I hope you can see this, but these are itsy bitsy maps showing the change in the spatial distribution of low income households between 2010 and 2017 up at the top. And so those of you familiar with Charlotte know that this red color here shows an increasing spatial concentration. So poverty is increasingly in this center, older first or second ring suburban neighborhoods within the metropolitan area. Then we looked at the spatial distribution of low wage jobs, and we can also see the change in here is also increasingly decentralized. So there is not this strong mismatch between low wage jobs and low wage workers in the way that John Kane observed things in 1968. So then we made a model and we tested how much of the access to low wage jobs between low income workers has an impact on these labor market outcomes. And what we found out was that increased accessibility did not have an impact on unemployment rates or the ability to find work, but it did have a significant impact on incomes. So that leads us to think that if you have more of a choice of jobs, you can choose a better paying job. And so it does have a better outcome in terms of economic mobility potentially. And this was only the case for lower income households. So higher income households, accessibility had no impact on unemployment rates or income. So that's our big finding from this study. And I'm going to turn it back over to Eli.
Great. Well, thank you. And we'll be talking more about your research as we move on and move through this. Our third panelist is Charlotte Assistant City Manager and Chief Planner Taiwo Jayoba. Special thanks extended to him for joining us, because if you've been paying attention to the local news recently, you know that this guy is doing like 4 community forums a day, it seems. Everywhere I go, I see Taiwo on a Zoom screen. He is also one of the leaders of the Charlotte Moves task force effort, figuring out how we're going to build our transportation transit system in this region and how we might pay for that moving forward. So I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Eli. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'll share a couple of slides with us this afternoon, if you could upload that. Thank you very much for inviting me to such an important and timely conversation, not just for our city, but frankly, nationally, especially as we gradually come out of this pandemic. I believe that three things are going to be very important as we gradually come out of this pandemic: the diversity of our city, the density of our city, but also something that will be very important is the connectivity in our city. Therefore, equity in mobility, economic mobility, and housing affordability are going to be crucial. I know that when the Charlotte Moves Task Force was formed by Mayor Lyles and Council back in February of 2020, was chaired by former Mayor Gant, made up of 25 members. And like Eli said, I was the staff person that led that group. The focus was on Charlotte at that point in time and making sure that people who live or work in Charlotte have safe and equitable mobility options to be able to get to wherever they go. So eventually the task force made their recommendations for a county-wide effort and an increase in sales tax. They say, how do we pay for this if we're going to really have a robust transportation network? That's not just about transit. We've had a little about that this afternoon, but also about transportation. So we have a balanced mobility system. Subsequently, the work came to be known as Transformation and Mobility Network, and it was connected to our land use plan, the 2040 Comprehensive Plan, which has 5 guiding principles to create an inclusive and diverse city, a livable and connected city, a healthy and sustainable city, a prosperous and innovative city, but also understanding the fact that Charlotte is a city in a region. Pre-pandemic, 51% of people who worked in Charlotte came from out of Mecklenburg County. 51% of people who came to work in Charlotte between Monday and Friday came out of Mecklenburg County. I believe that once we gradually move out of a pandemic, that number is likely going to go up because a number of people have moved here, Charlotte being number 6 in the country that has been recipient of a lot of in-migration from other parts of the country. And a lot of them are going to either be living in the suburbs and commuting to Charlotte for work, or perhaps they'll be working from home. But even when people work from home, they still need to have access to different things like childcare, grocery stores, drugstores. And we've seen the research from the University of Wisconsin that there seems to be more commute by people who work from home than people who actually get up in the morning, go to work, and come back in the evening. So the peak periods are now changing than we used to know. So the vision for this transformation and mobility network was beyond transit. It wasn't just about getting rail or bus on the street, but also how do we improve our road connectivity? How do we make sure that trails and sidewalks, the gaps in sidewalks are filled? And so it was very important to bring together something that will not just transform the way we move, but the way our city landscape is shaped in terms of land use. I think a popular transportation director that I happen to know said to me once that the best transportation plans are always good land use plans. And that's very important. Next slide, please. Again, this buttresses the point in the next slide that, it's a multimodal effort. It was not just about investment in rail. One of the things that we heard this morning is the fact that if people don't have access to public transit, they will rely on vehicles. Today in Charlotte, about 250,000 people do not drive or have access to a vehicle, either because they are non-English speakers or they are elderly people or they are 16 years or less. But how do we capture some of these people who still need to get to work wherever they choose to go? So each mode that was proposed by the Transformation and Mobility Network or the Charlotte Moves Task Force has different purposes to carry different people. Today, between Monday and Friday, 80% of people who use our system will rely on the bus network. But if the bus is not reliable and if it's not frequent, then obviously people are not able to access the jobs that they would like to. So for us, it's really about increasing people's access to jobs via public transit and other means of mobility, increasing the housing stock, so that when you increase that housing stock, you decrease the amount of expenses on housing for people, thereby impacting affordability and thereby impacting people's income. Very important, however, to also understand that while the task force was working on this, other cities and towns in our region were also working on their comprehensive plans, such as Huntersville or Davidson, Matthews or Pineville, because there's such a connection between where people live and how they move. It's so important where they work, where they play, where they live, and how they connect in the urban space without having to drive so many times is so important. So what's next for us? Is I will categorize that into three buckets. The funding refinement. We had said that this will cost about $8 to $12 billion over a period over 10 years. But that was defined by that task force. As the transformation and mobility network becomes more countywide, we need to refine that dollar amount and see what exactly will the transit piece cost. What will the bus piece cost? The bus transit piece, the greenway, the pedestrian bicycle roadway, not just in Charlotte, but throughout the county. And then we still have to work on the legislative process as well, because we need the approval of the General Assembly to allow us to even get to put anything on a referendum. But the political bucket or the governance bucket might be the most important one, is that we have to come together to realize that, like Eli said at the beginning, someone going from Salisbury to Huntersville and had to spend over 8 hours round trip using about 12 different routes, inbound and outbound, that's not acceptable for a growing and thriving metropolis. So as a region, we definitely need to be thinking together as to how do we give people more access to work, but how do we also impact their housing cost so that they have more disposable income and not have to spend a quarter of their income like they do today on transportation, and more than that, even on housing. And so how do we make sure that we balance that in such a way that we can get people to live close to where they work and get them to also be able to access whatever means of mobility, whether by riding their bicycle or by rolling their wheelchairs on sidewalk in order to get from one place to the other. So that's what we're working on today. There's a lot of things going on in our region, not just in Charlotte, but Connect Beyond, or looking at definitely Division 477 in terms of how do we connect from South Carolina all the way to Stateville in a seamless way, because people continue to spread out in our region. That's the role of this transformation and mobility network. Each mode has a purpose, but the important thing is that people want to be able to move seamlessly, whether they're going to work or whatever they're doing live in the Charlotte region. So I will end there. Thank you very much for having me this morning or this afternoon.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think now we're going to turn to some questions for the panelists. And we've got a few rounds of questions here lined up, and we'll go through those. And as you listen, again, in the audience, please let us know what your questions are, put them in the chat, and we'll pull those out and get to those next. And so the first question here we've got lined up is for Dr. Blumenberg. And you kind of touched on this during your presentation, but I think a lot of the dialogue around transportation in urban environments tends to focus on the dichotomy between cars and transit, or immediately getting people out of cars. But in a city like Charlotte, obviously even more in a city like LA, we're a very auto-centric culture, and you can't just flick that switch. So what does your research show about the relationship between transportation and economic mobility, and how are changes in where people live and how they get around affecting that relationship? And I believe you are muted.
Sorry,
No
let's
problem.
start again. I showed those graphs about the sort of the access advantage. So transit does best in dense urban environments where origins and destinations are reasonably proximate. So travel times are relatively short, and it makes that transportation component of people's lives a bit sort of easier. Cars have this access advantage. They also have other advantages that I think are important to this conversation because they relate to this whole, suburbanization of the poor as well. Another great benefit of automobiles is how flexible sort of they are. And this is particularly important, for example, for women who are oftentimes juggling paid work and household work. So it's not, we talk a lot about that commute to work, but there are other advantages. I mean, I talk to my students about really hard to go to Costco and get a giant package of toilet paper and carry it on your bike or public transit. So cars serve that function as well. So it shouldn't come as a surprise to know that there is a large body of research that does link having access to an automobile to employment outcomes, including some of my own work. But it's work by planners and economists or whatnot, layered on to what Dr. Delmel talked about. This literature on the spatial mismatch early on didn't factor in the fact that there was a transportation mismatch as well. And so that piece of it turns out plays a very big role in terms of employment outcomes, for one, so the likelihood of being employed, and then sort of secondarily earnings as well. So the ability, for example, to juggle multiple jobs is useful as well. And then the last comment I'll make about this is that it's very difficult to look for a job without a car. So evidence from surveys suggests that cars are particularly important as part of the job search. So going from multiple places to fill out applications, particularly when you don't know where you're going, right? And you're not familiar with how you might get there on public transit. Once you actually land a job, it may be that transit connects you fine to that job. But the actual job search piece, I think, is a component of this process that is understood, less well studied, and seems to be, at least from the survey results, a really important component to all of this.
And if any of our other panelists, by the way, if you hear something you want to chime in, feel free. We can have that back and forth as well. Our next question here is for Dr. Delmel, and that's, we tend to assume in the dialogue around gentrification that lower income people are worse off when they move farther away from transit, from centers, largely because of fears that they might lack access to a reliable vehicle, and as we've been talking about, find it more difficult to access employment opportunities and the other things we've been talking about. What does your work show about that in Charlotte? And what can we say about whether low-income workers, low-income residents here are worse off when they move farther out to our farther suburbs and bedroom communities?
Sure. So we really wanted to answer this question, and we found what everybody else who has tried to find the so-called displaced people is that they're really hard to locate. So I think you can put up the slide here. As part of our study, tried to locate people who had moved from the urban core out to outlying areas of the Charlotte metropolitan area. And despite huge efforts, we were only able to identify 8 people to participate in our study. There was also a small pandemic thrown in there. So it's really hard to generalize. Those of us who do quantitative studies do not like to talk about sample sizes of 8, but from these 8 women who spoke to us, you can see there where they moved from in the map on the left. When we talked to them, and specifically our researcher, Claire Such, having access to a vehicle wasn't on their, again, this is just 8, wasn't on the top of their list of concerns. So some of them were having trouble finding employment, but it wasn't because they didn't have a car. It was more related to these other aspects, such as educational attainment or skills mismatch. 7 out of these 8 had never used public transportation, so they must have had a vehicle. So we can't conclude anything general from this sample size. We really wish that we could figure out a way to better study this population. And again, we tried all kinds of tricks, and many people have discovered this before. So I can't give you a definitive answer, but at least of these 8 women, transportation didn't come to their forefront of their mind.
So an opportunity for more study.
Always.
And our next question is for Taiwo here, and that is, we have in this region spent a lot of time talking about our ranking as 50th out of 50 in economic mobility from the Chetty study. I think that was something that still resonates a lot. And we also, as we mentioned, have growing problems with congestion here. Do you see direct links between those things, and how are the city's planning efforts around transportation tied to economic mobility? And then should they be more closely tied together?
Yeah, thank you very much, Eli, for that question. So when you think about the fact that we're 50 out of 50, people don't often ask who are the top 49 cities. I like the fact that we embraced it. I think Atlanta is 49 and Raleigh is 48, but the fact is that we embraced it and we decided to take action. We even set up a task force to help us, navigate our way through it. One of the things that the task force quickly came up with is the lack of alignment between transportation and housing is one of the reasons why we rank so low. And that if we really want to, make an improvement in our ranking in the future, if that ever happens, we will have to closely align transportation and housing, especially for low-income communities. I always say that Charlotte is, by the way, Salt Lake City is number one on that ranking. And a lot of people don't often think about it that way, but Salt Lake City has a lot of social services that they provide to low-income people and minority community. But not only that, they also have one of the most robust light rail system in the country. A lot of cities that are ahead of us in that ranking actually have very robust transit system or transportation system, whether it's Seattle or New York or San Francisco or San Jose or Pittsburgh or Denver. They are all ranking in the top 10 in that space. Now in Charlotte, especially in the place we call the Crescent, which is north of Uptown, east and west of South Charlotte, 48% of residents in the Crescent spent 25% of their income on housing, and about 25%, another 25% on their income, on transportation. Compare that to 16% of people who live in the Wedge, who spend 25% of their income on housing. So 48% versus 16% between the Crescent and the Wedge. And that's really where that 50 out of 50 issue is for us, is we're such a car-dependent city. About 77% of our folks are single occupant drivers. And in a city, like I said earlier, where about 250,000 people do not drive or have access to a vehicle. So if you live in Charlotte and you are low income and you live in the Crescent and you have no vehicle or a means of getting to work, you're likely not going to find a job, or if you find one, you're going to lose it. I actually had someone who called me one time and they were taking public transit to get to work, but they had to transfer and they missed their transfer. They lost the job. Somebody was looking for an apartment in which they put down an application and they were going back to actually, because they won the lottery, right? And you have to get back there on time to be able to put down the down payment. Because they couldn't make a transfer or they couldn't find someone to take them or couldn't afford a Uber or Lyft, they lost that opportunity. So people lose a lot simply because there's no alignment between transportation and housing, especially in the Crescent where a majority of our Black and Brown community live. The Charlotte Moves Task Force concluded that 39% of low-income earners, 39% of people who earn low income in Charlotte are served by our current transportation system, which means that we don't go where most people live. That's essentially what that's saying. But that if we were to invest in this transformation and mobility network, that number goes up to about 91%. So if we invest in greenways, we invest in bikeways, we invest in good sidewalks, we invest in bus transit, reliable, frequent, and rail system that's expanded beyond what we have today, we might actually be able to get more of our low-income earners to get to work. And so there's just a huge connection between, our story of upward mobility, why we rank 50 out of 50, and that misalignment between transportation, accessibility, and housing. Once we start bridging that gap and we start providing more mobility options, and I will continue to say this, more housing stock, I think there's a way we can actually impact how people are able to access jobs and other things that make for a good quality of life in a thriving city like Charlotte.
I think that segues into a question that I wanted to ask Dr. Blumenberg next, which is, we've talked about some of the issues here. We've also talked about how transportation encompasses more than just transit, also, vehicles. We've had people asking in the chat about greenways, trails, bikeways, all kinds of different things. What can we do to improve transportation access, especially for lower income people? And what does the national research tell us about ways we can make this maybe make an impact on this problem and help improve this for people?
So would it be okay if I first made a couple of comments about suburbanization and then talked about policy?
Sure.
Just building on.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, so I just want to kind of build up. So so data from a number of metropolitan areas around the country actually shows that the job access by any mode for low-wage workers is best in the urban core, so in and around neighborhoods around downtown. And so we see that suburbanization of low sort of income families, like we saw in that graph for Charlotte, in metropolitan areas around the country. And I think we just need to keep in mind that suburbs are very, very dispersed. So even if there are more low-income households that are living there, and over time, jobs are suburbanizing as well. So even if there are more jobs that are located there, individuals and households are going to be operating in a very dispersed environment, which is going to be challenging for modes other than the automobile to serve. Even if someone can use transit to get to their job, again, it's likely in this dispersed environment that they're going to have to be reliant on an automobile for other trip purposes, which is why you also see that even among low-income households, those who are able to move to the suburbs are more likely to have a car. Otherwise, they cannot navigate in that environment. They cannot function in that environment. So let me turn to the question that you did ask me, which is about policy. So first, on the auto side of things, I mean, there's a network of low-income auto ownership programs around the country. Some are funded by public funds, some are nonprofit organizations sort of running these programs. In California, we're lucky to have resources from the state's cap and trade program that has been used for a lot of different purposes, including, sort of investments in public transit and active transportation as well, but also automobiles. So there's a state-funded program to actually subsidize the retirement of old gross polluting vehicles. So lots of low-income households, if they have a car, they have an older car that is not as fuel efficient, not as environmentally friendly. So the idea is to retire those vehicles and then to subsidize the purchase of a cleaner fuel vehicle. So it could be a Prius, it could be an electric vehicle. There's now a series of evaluations of those programs that are happening to just see how effective those programs are. So one is thinking about cars. The second is, we've talked about ownership, but at this point, I tell my, I don't have very many CDs anymore. We stream music and we stream videos. And so now we have sort of an opportunity, it's not without challenges, but to actually have auto access without ownership in the form of, ride hailing. LA has a car share program, Blue LA. It is for subsidized sort of rides for low income travelers. So I think that we need to sort of separate out the ownership from the access, and certainly some of those services can also serve as first and last mile transportation for public transit. And then on the auto side, I think we need to continue to remove some of the institutional barriers to driving. So driver's licensing restrictions for undocumented immigrants. Many states prohibit licensing among undocumented immigrants. Luckily, at this point, California is not one of them. The civil rights organizations are working on driver's license suspensions for non-driving reasons. So most states suspend licenses for unpaid tickets, for example, right? So if we have racial disparities in policing, we also have racial disparities in driver's license suspensions. And so we need to be thinking about that. Just a couple other comments. So on the transit side of things, there's no question that transit is a lifeline for those that don't have cars. I think we need to make investments in public transit where transit works best. And so those are going to be in relatively dense sort of urban areas. And it's very clear if you look at the sort of the income and the racial composition of riders on bus relative to trains. Bus is the workhorse because of its flexibility. And so we need to make bus investments. Taiwo already talked about affordable housing. I think that that's key. I don't, it's, in places like Los Angeles, we're desperate for affordable housing. We've produced so little affordable housing, but it's really important to have that housing available so low-income households can choose to live in the neighborhoods that best meets their needs. It may be living around a rail station. It may be access to a high quality school as well, right? So other neighborhood. And then I mentioned in my opening, I think we put an undue burden on transit agencies. I mean, they can all do better in terms of serving low-income communities and low-wage workers. But unless we manage driving, and most of the driving is not happening by low-income workers or households, most of it is happening by higher income households and workers who are fairly free to drive on our roads and highways, right? We don't give away electricity for free, other parts of our infrastructure, but we give away driving for free, and most of it by higher income households. Unless we better manage driving, transit is always going to have a difficult time. And so I think that needs to be part of the conversation.
And by managed, I assume you're talking about things like toll lanes. We've got I-77 here, which has certainly stoked years of controversy and, political fights. So thank you for giving us plenty to talk about there. That'll definitely resonate with local folks. I want to ask Dr. Delmel one more question here before we turn to a few from our audience that we've lined up. And that is, as we invest in new lines like the Silver Line, east-west, the Blue Line extension, we've had a lot of focus on gentrification and whether, displacement kind of automatically goes with transit. I think a lot of people assume that there's, kind of one-to-one cause and effect relationship there, and our communities are wrestling with how to approach that during planning for the next phase of transit in Charlotte. Now, what does your research show about that, and what can we say about whether gentrification in Charlotte has been spurred by our transit investments?
Yeah, thanks. So my colleague Isabel Nilsson and I have studied this quite a bit in a number of cities and using lots of different data sources. And so our first answer to this question of does transit cause gentrification is not usually, but sometimes. So when all of the conditions are prime and you've got a fast growing city and a lot of demand for housing, like in Charlotte, then if you add something that's new and shiny into those fast growing, already attractive areas, yes, it might help supercharge it and tell developers invest here and develop here. So surely it can add, we would say, to the acceleration of changes that are already taking place. But if anybody, for instance, has ever been to Buffalo, New York, and there's no traffic and there's not a whole lot of population growth. When they added a transit line in the early 1990s, it did not radically transform the city, right? So it's not the train, but the train is an additional amenity and an additional investment in a community that's probably already starting to change and can speed that up. So that's our pitch. So for the specific case of Charlotte, I can't tell you about displacement. We don't have data on individual movements out, but I can tell you a little bit about something and the changes of who's moving in. So this is along the Blue Line extension. We've looked at mortgage lending data since they announced the Blue Line extension was coming in around 2011. So these trends in this graph here, what we've seen is, in fact, since they announced that we're going to indeed build this Blue Line extension, we did see a big change in the racial and income composition of people applying for mortgages along the Blue Line extension. And it was significantly different than similar neighborhoods that had similar characteristics elsewhere in the city. So we see a big drop. I think that the orange line here is the Blue Line extension. So we see a significant drop in the share of Black or African-American loan applicants along that transit corridor. It was pretty high and now it's sharply declined. And we also see a relatively steep increase in the income composition. So you might look at this and say, see, I told you, transit causes gentrification. But if we go to the next slide, this is not the case everywhere. These changes are not uniform across the entire light rail corridor. So when we were trying to model this and kind of disentangle the role of transit from all of the other confounding factors, another big factor was proximity to NODA, right? So being close to a neighborhood that had already gentrified way before we had light rail. And this was, if this is NODA right over here, highest prices are down there close to the center city. Again, they're walkable. That was another significant variable. They have access to all of these different amenities. So again, put in the train and sure, things changed, but then further up the line, we haven't seen quite as many changes. So that just kind of fits our narrative of it depends. If the conditions are prime, things are starting to change. Sure, you add in a train station and they're going to probably speed up, but things are not changing as quickly. Up here, further up the line, closer to the campus, we don't see quite the dramatic change.
Well, as always, it's complicated.
It depends.
It's complicated and it depends. So I'd like to turn now to some of the audience questions we've had come in from the chat. So maybe if everyone on the panel could turn our cameras on and just kind of take these as you see fit. I'll throw some of these out there. So Jeff asks, would transit investment be better spent on a lower cost bus system improvements and maybe road projects, leaving more public dollars for affordable housing, job skills training, etc.? And I think that's about the the big cost difference we see between investing in the bus system and building new light rail lines, which is really significant in a dispersed geography like we have here.
Well, maybe I can jump in on that then. I do not disagree. If ridership is the focus, then that's what we have to do. We have to make sure that we invest in a robust bus system, bus network. The challenges we have, number one, our streets and our entire city is not designed for transit. It's designed for vehicles. And so you cannot be driving 40, 60-footer buses on narrow, smaller roads. You increase cost of maintaining and operating those roads as you do that. So if we're going to invest in those buses, then they've got to be buses that can really get closer to people rather than be invasive in their corridors or too far for them. Secondly, is the buses have not yet proven that it can generate the same economic returns that we have seen on rail investment. Even though rail investment has been known to result in displacement in certain parts of the country, I mean, from what we've heard from the research of Dr. Delmel, it hasn't been significant here as it is in other parts of the country. But the fact is that there's a lot of economic revenues that you generate as a result of rail investment. That doesn't happen if you have a bus system. So again, it depends on what we're trying to do, whether we're targeting ridership or we're targeting investment. I would say we target ridership. That way we can get people closer to work. We can get them to childcare. We can get them to the doctor. We can get them to the dentist, and make it frequent and reliable rather than investing in a whole lot of other things. Rail is not going to get us everywhere, but rail is going to be a major spine while buses can connect to that.
Anyone else think we should be, I remember Dr. Blumenberg, you suggested increasing bus service as a kind of a priority to get low-income residents where they need to go immediately, riders of necessity.
Yeah. There are benefits to rail. So as Taiwo just sort of mentioned. So, and I don't want to minimize the benefits. And I think that those benefits, I mean, the rail is the capital costs of rail are extraordinarily expensive, which Jeff, the person who asked this question, mentioned. So you always have to do this cost benefit sort of ratio. My interest is thinking about how to improve sort of access through transit and other modes for those who need it the most. And I think the evidence is convincing that it is around it is around the bus network. It is more flexible, lower wage workers. There's a positive relationship between trip distances and income. Yeah. So higher wage workers travel further. And so they get a benefit, especially if it's a flat fare, they get a huge benefit per mile on some of the rail systems. Low income travelers are using transit to get to work, but they're also using transit if they don't have a car to get to other destinations as well. Their trips tend to be shorter, they tend to be more dispersed. And so I haven't looked at the data for Charlotte, but if you look at the US data, I've looked at it for Los Angeles. If you just look at the demographic composition of of riders by transit mode, they're almost diametrically the opposite, right? Ridership on rail, very high income. Rail does best getting workers from the outer periphery into the urban, into downtown areas. That's typically how they're structured. Buses are much more flexible. They better meet the needs of low income travelers. And this was also, the whole topic was the subject of a big civil rights lawsuit in Los Angeles against the LA Metro, so the big transit sort of agency as well, just around these equity grants.
We've got another question here from Ron Tober, the godfather of Charlotte Transit, former leader of the Charlotte area transit system. And he wanted to ask Taiwo Jayoba specifically, with the expansion of telecommuting due to the pandemic, what impact do you see on the current transit plans? And, I know that Dr. Blumenberg has also studied ridership trends for a while in other contexts. So let's start with you, Taiwo. What do you think about that?
Well, so I use the rail system a couple times a week. When the pandemic first started, I think I was one of the last people to stop using it once we shut down for a month. But when I started using it, I was also one of the few ones who started. But in the last couple of weeks, I have seen gradually a higher number of people actually using transit, which tells me that people are coming back. I also use the bus line from Waverly on Providence all the way to walk uptown, and gradually I'm seeing people increasing in number. I think it was the 1917 or so flu where New York lost millions of ridership, and within a year after recovery, almost rebounded about 10 times. I believe we're going to rebound. Yes, there will be telecommuting, but we are also going to see that people who telecommute don't necessarily stay at home. The fact that you're telecommuting doesn't mean you stay at home. You still need to go to different places. And over time, we're going to see some shift. maybe an increase of 6 to 9% is what I have heard in terms of people who telecommute. I believe that that would not necessarily be a major ding on transit ridership, but it may not happen overnight. I think it will probably take a while as people gain more confidence in our system.
Excuse me, I was muted there. I know we are right up on 1, but if people are okay with staying a couple more minutes, I'd love to just knock out a few of these quickly. So we know if you're watching, you might have to drop off, but we are going to get to a few more questions. Anyone else have any thoughts on how the post-COVID world might look different for transportation and how we get to work and whether we go to work physically?
Happy to just say a few words. I think, I know that there's a lot of questions about what's going to happen after the pandemic. And, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of people studying this and doing surveys and trying to sort of speculate what's going to come next. And, certainly for the transportation folks, and I don't envy Taiwo, to try to figure out, to anticipate what's going to happen, I think is really difficult. And I've just been listening to, and then I'm going to tell just a little bit about the telecommuting and travel, but I mean, it is likely that the telecommuting post-COVID is going to be, it was increasing before the pandemic. It is likely to remain relatively high or higher than pre-pandemic. But how much higher, we don't know. And it does seem like, in sort of following the discussion, that it's likely that it will be some combination for most workers, even if they're telecommuting, that they're not only going to telecommute, that they will have to show up at the workplace occasionally. But what about low-wage workers? They're way less likely to telecommute, right? And so there's been, so lots of survey information about that. They don't have they don't have jobs that allow them that kind of flexibility. So they will be traveling, which is, kind of to link it to the previous question, is yet another reason why we really do need to think about the transportation that serves low-income communities, including the public transit piece of all of this. Transit ridership during the pandemic is much low. The incomes of riders are much lower. Those that have cars are either staying at home, right? Or they're using their cars to get around. A lot of low-wage essential workers are on the buses and the trains. And then finally, just to underscore something that Taiwo said, the transportation researchers have been doing a bunch of surveying, and people are doing a lot of traveling. So the vehicle miles of travel, VMT, even with all the telecommuting, VMT is bounced back up. People are moving sort of around on the roads and highways, perhaps less likely to do it during rush hour, right? Because they're working at home, they're making trips in the middle of the day or whatnot. Their work schedules are more flexible. But I want to underscore that for low-wage workers, they're going to be traveling, and we need to address their transportation needs.
And we've got a question here from John Gallus, which is an investment of $8 to $12 billion, like we're talking about in the Charlotte Moves Task Force, is really sizable. And he wanted to know, why are we not exploring this from an economic development perspective with more focus on the satellite areas and the outlying parts of our region than on the core, kind of at the nexus of it all? And I think that gets to a bigger question, which is how can we design and think about transit in effectively and fitting into such a dispersed region where we have all these different urban and suburban cores emerging, and there's much less of a need for everyone to maybe flow into the center of the city and then flow out at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you one thing that's unique about Charlotte. I assume that question is directed at me, but one thing that's unique about, people compare us to Atlanta. And they always say that Atlanta is not a bigger city than Charlotte. Atlanta as a city has less than 500,000 people. It's the region around Atlanta that's about 5-point-some million people. Charlotte as a city, on the other hand, has about almost 900,000 people, and the region around us is right about, it depends on how you define that region. If you define it as outside Mecklenburg, maybe 2-point-some million people. Because Atlanta is, a lot of people come to Atlanta to work, come from the suburbs and the satellite towns, and Atlanta is busy in the morning and then busy when people leave. As soon as people leave, you don't see a whole lot of people. Charlotte is not like that. We're constantly having something happen because we're the job center of the region, and a lot of people come here to do a lot of business. If we're going to solve the problem of connectivity, we've got to acknowledge and embrace the fact that there will be other communities like Kannapolis, like Huntersville, like Davidson, Cornelius, Pineville, York, Rock Hill, that will also be increasingly becoming job centers, and people will rather work closer to home than to have to commute further. And we have about 14 different transit agencies throughout this region. I think the Charlotte will continue probably to be the only rail, but if every one of these cities invest in services that support seniors and those who are disabled or those who need doctor support, they can actually do a lot of effective job within their community. Someone who lives in Hanson, for example, doesn't have to come all the way to Charlotte to do business if there's a job center close enough. So I think that work is going on right now through Connect Beyond, as they look at 2 states, 12 jurisdictions, looking at different services, rural and urban, that can actually serve different clientele in every one of those communities without necessarily all having to come to Charlotte over time. That also impacts housing affordability too. As people look outside to have affordable housing, they still want to commute back to Charlotte for work. And I believe that it's our responsibility to have a seamless means of moving and connecting all these disparate areas so that people can either transfer using the same card, or we have a smart fare system that people don't have to necessarily be buying different bus passes depending on which one they're transferring from.
Well, I think we'll end with one more question here, and I'm going to kind of combine 2 audience questions because they're both about transportation, economic mobility, and equity. And the first is from Liam, who asks, can you speak to your thoughts on the roles, if any, that greenways and urban trails play in the movement towards equitable transportation and economic mobility? And the second is Nicole Peterson, who wants to know if free transit systems, fair free transit systems in Charlotte might help with access to equitable transportation in Charlotte, and if that's something we need to look at. So greenways, trails, other ways of moving around, can that improve access? What's the role of that in equity? And then eliminating fares. Same question, is that something we need to think of as having a major role in transportation equity in Charlotte? I think you're muted.
You want me to go for that? So I'll take the second question first. I am yet to see, unless maybe Dr. Blumenberg can tell us or Dr. Delmel can tell us, but I am yet to see a major city that has successfully implemented free fare throughout their system successfully with increasing ridership all the way. I have seen short bursts of ridership increase, but not necessarily sustained. What we have found out, at least in my experience, is that free does not necessarily translate to increased ridership. It does help to a degree. What I would propose is fare capping, if we can, especially for low-income people, and maybe make it free on the weekends. But because of shift workers who go to hotels and restaurants to work, weekends will be better for them. But during Monday to Friday, if we're talking about equity, maybe it's not necessarily just eliminating fares, because you can't do it for certain people, right? And then not do it for some. You've got to have a way, because the day you want to increase that fare again as a result of shortfall in revenue, you're going to have a lot of protests on your hand. So it's always important to say, maybe we should cap fare and then make them free on weekends. So that's one. Secondly, greenways are absolutely important to the entire transportation network. Absolutely. Sometimes that's the only thing people define as quality of life. Atlanta Beltline is a case in point. The thing with greenways, though, is that they almost have the same impact as transit corridors in terms of they could easily gentrify and displace. So in Atlanta, they put together a community benefit program that will actually help people who live along the Atlanta Beltline corridor, so that the developer, whoever is building housing, can dedicate some to affordable housing for those who live along that corridor to mitigate displacement. We have a very good potential and opportunity here in Charlotte as well, which is again why the Transformation and Mobility Network includes what we call a greenway superhighway, where we can actually have everyone within half a mile of a greenway, whether it's connecting it to the Charlotte to the Carolina Thread Trail, or really being expanding the Cross Charlotte Trail. However we choose to do it, working hand in hand with the county and with the state, because it's absolutely important, especially during this pandemic. We've seen the value of greenways. People don't drive, but they will take a walk along the greenway, or just run and exercise themselves.
I can add one more thing. I think that, of course, greenways are important and great for quality of life, but we also just need to complete our sidewalk network, right? So if we think about, again, those older suburbs that need bus connectivity, they're also treacherous to walk on. So increasing connectivity by walking and by bus transit in those older areas, I would say is a better equity investment than free transit, because it's not just about the fare, it's about the connectivity and being able to get places. That's my final word.
I don't know anything about greenways or trails. I think they're great. I mean, I like them, but I'm not the right person to speak on that. But I will weigh in on the fare-free transit sort of piece of this. And in surveys of sort of low-income transit users, when you've asked them at least their kind of stated preferences around policies, they don't often talk about the actual price of the bus fare. Not that it doesn't serve as a hardship for some, but we just talked about relative to automobiles, transit for the user is expensive to provide the service, right? But for the user is relatively cheap. What time is money? What they will say, like everybody else, is they want service improvements. They want the bus to show up frequently so they could get to their destinations in a reasonable time. So the service improvements are much more important than the fare itself. During COVID, ridership was very poor, again, for the reasons that I suggested. And so there were some reasons during COVID why agencies might want to and did consider fare-free transit. And also it was it continues to be a very difficult time economically for some households, particularly those that lost jobs. In general, and I think my students will probably disagree with me, I think fare-free transit is not a good idea. Fare-free is a flat fare. That means everybody, regardless of income, pays nothing. That advantage, that benefit, all flat fares, and there's been many studies about flat fares, that benefits higher income households that are traveling further. They're getting a free ride. I think those households should pay. I think that we should think of other mechanisms to support. If fares are an issue for some low-income households, there are better mechanisms than a free transit for everybody to better support the needs of low-income sort of transit riders. And I think that having some kind of graduated fare, off-peak fare, all of those would do a better job of benefiting low-income transit users.
Well, thank you all for participating. Thank you all for your time on the panel. Thank you for giving us your time as audience members and those questions. I hope everyone learned something from this, and we'll be talking about transportation in Charlotte for a long time to come. We will be doing several more Schul conversations in the fall, focusing on topics like the relationship between health and economic mobility and workforce development. And those will build up to our annual event, the Schul Forum, in November. So stay tuned for more information about that. And we look forward to seeing you all back here in the Zoom space for another virtual conversation in the fall. Hope everyone has a great rest of the day.